In this video, we're going to examine the retrial of Lucy Letby with regard to child K. This occurred in July 2024 after her original conviction on 14 counts in relation to attempted murder and murder at the Cancer Chester Hospital. I retain the belief that this retrial only occurred because criticism was already brewing at that stage and there were media articles on the horizon, and this effectively gagged people for approximately 8 months over that period, 2023 to 2024. As we go into the details of this retrial, we will see that there is such a paucity of evidence that it's hard to see any possible justification for seeking a retrial. Now, of course, the system may argue that Lucy Letby was found guilty, therefore it was worthwhile, but I think in the climate that existed at that time, after there had been an enormous amount of media coverage of the original trial, I can't see any conceivable way that this could have been a fair trial. But we're going to get into that as the video continues. So you can see on the screen now the process that took place for the retrial in relation to child K. This took 2 weeks. You think it's fairly extraordinary that they managed to drag the court process out for 14 days, considering there was absolutely no evidence in this trial of wrongdoing whatsoever. But it's the usual thing of the prosecution call the mother into the witness box, and then you see all the statements from people that were working at the Cancer Chester at the time. There's some police stuff, and so it goes on. All of this is basically completely irrelevant because Lucy Letby is accused of tampering with a tube in relation to this infant. And this infant died 3 days later at a completely different hospital. So the clinical picture of the infant in this case is absolutely irrelevant. And I'll probably remind you of this as the video continues, but Dr. Evans did not list this as being a suspicious infant. Even Dr. Evans didn't consider this to be a suspicious case. This infant died three days after Lucy Letby had any contact with the child. So all of these things about the transport team and you'll see some of the reasons for this as we continue, but it's all essentially just complete waffle that has nothing to do with the matter in hand. But we're going to get into the key aspects of this trial in this video. Now, another thing that I'd like to note about the retrial of child K is that in the original trial, only 3 days were devoted to child K, as you can see here. Whereas in the retrial, they made a big deal out of throwing as much at Lucy Letby as possible. The reason for that, of course, is firstly, a certain amount of reputation has been invested in this case by sending it for retrial. If they hadn't secured a conviction, then it would have looked even more ridiculous than it does now. And then, of course, they can devote all of the resources of the prosecution towards this infant. In the original trial, they must have realised this is one of the weakest cases. It really relies on almost no evidence. I would say literally no evidence. Whereas in this case, we can try and dig up a bit more material. Now, you may reflect on the fairness of this, or otherwise, it seems extremely unfair that suddenly this case on which Lucy has essentially been acquitted, or which there's no verdict anyway, now all of a sudden she gets a lot more resources thrown at her and they can build a different case. And indeed they did put a different case in court because numerous people appeared who didn't appear in the first trial. So what happened here is they used all of their resources possible. They threw as much as Lucy as possible because this is now treated as a standalone case. But not only is it a standalone case, but they can use the previous convictions against her as well. So there was this enormous raft of stuff being thrown at Lucy in this case in order to get a prosecution so that they could justify the fact there was a retrial, when really a retrial wasn't justified at all. So one example of this is that there is actually obstetric input for the retrial, which, as you can see in the previous slide, didn't appear in the original court case. Now, as we know, this has been a massive bone of contention whereby there should be obstetric information in numerous, if not every infant in the original court case, but it's just simply not there because no one sought this information. But suddenly an obstetrician appears in this retrial. Now, why would that occur, you might wonder, considering that no one bothered to look at the obstetric picture for any of the infants where it actually matters. Bear in mind, in this case, this is nothing really to do with the clinical picture of the infant. It's nothing to do with the collapse of the infant. It's nothing to do with the death of the infant, because this all happens elsewhere. It's just to do with one tube extubation in the County-Chester Hospital. So why is the obstetrician being called in? And I would suggest a simple reason for that is the prosecution has to kind of explain away the fact that the infant dies somewhere else 3 days later and claim that this is irrelevant and sort of downplay this. So in order to do this, they bring in the obstetrician who has to defend the decision of the County-Chester to allow this infant to be born prematurely in this hospital, even though there are obviously, at best, very serious question marks about this. And you see here Dr. Sarah Brigham defending the birth of child K in the County-Chester Hospital. And then there's some further discussion here. The decision not to transfer child K to a tertiary centre was the correct one, according to Dr. Brigham. Even with hindsight, it was the right decision and she stands by her judgment. So Ben Myers then raises issues about the transfer. Dr. Brigham agrees that in an ideal world, the transfer would have taken place. But she reiterated the decision not to transfer was the right one. In Chester, the care was then optimised for child K's mother. But I would question whether that is possible, considering what we now know about this hospital. Was it possible for them to optimise care even to the standard of a level 2 unit, let alone to the standard of a level 3 unit? And it must be emphasised this infant was ultimately transferred to Arrow Park Hospital, where the infant sadly died 3 days, as I mentioned, after Lucy Letby had contact with the infant. But you can see immediately here the prosecution are pulling out all the stops, and this is what the prosecution are allowed to do, and this is what can happen in a potential retrial of the entire case. They can put a completely different prosecution case in court. That's going to be very difficult for them in terms of the potential retrial of the whole case. But for this case, they were just, everything was on their side in terms of public opinion and the public image of the case at this time. So they just hit Lucy with as many things as they could, and they knew very well the defence would say, come on, this infant was chronically unwell, no one disputes this, and the infant passed away in a different hospital 3 days after Lucy Letby had any contact with the infant. How can you possibly say that the collapse is even significant, let alone that Lucy Letby caused it, considering there's no evidence? So the only reason they're putting this in the court case is to try and hand wave that away, essentially. So the first thing I'm going to look at here is the evidence for Elizabeth Morgan, described here as a nursing advisory consultant. She also appeared in the original trial where exactly the same evidence was given, essentially. Now, there's 3 problems with Elizabeth Morgan appearing in this court case and with what she actually provided for this court case. The first one is that she's not a neonatal nurse, and frankly, she doesn't really know what she's talking about. I do go into this in some significant depth in my book. I'm not going to go into it in depth here because there's a lot to get through. And I do go through this whole issue of what she claims to be the case here. I have no idea why she's stating this. She shouldn't even be involved in the court case. As to why she's making statements that turn out to be plain wrong about something she knows nothing about, I have no idea. So the second problem is she didn't appear in the court case. She just was allowed to give a statement. Why she wasn't summoned to appear as a witness, and why she didn't have to appear in the witness box, and why she couldn't be cross-examined when her evidence was central to the whole court case and the whole that this particular retrial was absolutely central to it. I think it's completely wrong. And then the third thing is what she says is categorically incorrect. So apart from that, she was a great person to have in the court case, but we'll go over the significance of what occurred in relation to her. So she gives her professional opinion on the situation. She says it's very unlikely that a nurse would leave the incubator unless they were confident the baby was stable and the ET tube was in place, and would alert a nursing colleague to tend to that baby if an alarm should sound in their absence. She adds, in her professional experience in a poorly saturating baby of child-case gestational age, it would be standard good nursing practice to observe the baby, ascertain any causing changes, and take any corrective action, calling for help from staffing members if necessary. A series of checks would be carried out, including if the ET tube had been dislodged. She added, I do not believe it would be normal nursing practice to wait and see if the baby self-corrected. As I say, that is just simply plain wrong. So that was then cited here by the prosecution in their closing evidence, in the closing statement of Nick Johnson. And then it was also cited again by the judge in the summing up, which I won't put on the screen now, but Lucy is asked here. So Lucy must be in a pretty bad state of mind at this point, because she's been in prison for some 6 to 8 months, and then she's dragged into court again, already facing 14 full life orders. And then she's asked about this evidence, if you can call it that, from Elizabeth Morgan. And she's asked about the risk of planned extubation. And Lucy quite rightly points out that she knows what the standard practice was in Chester, and she knows what the policy was. Then Nick Johnson says for 25-week gestation babies, then she says for any baby. From my experience at Liverpool Women's is that you would not put your hands in the incubator, you would wait to self-correct. For a 25-week gestation baby, you are lying, aren't you? No. And you are lying because you know you were caught by Dr Jayaram? No. So I think it's absolutely disgraceful that Lucy's being accused of lying over something about which she is absolutely correct. How the defence don't manage to get into the court case that she was definitively correct. There's so many ways that they could do this, and they failed to do that. They obviously did mount a defence on this case, and I'm informed that Ben Myers did a very good job of cross-examination in this case, and that he destroyed Jayaram. But the court has nevertheless heard incorrect information about nursing. They've then heard Nick Johnson accuse Lucy Letby of lying. It should have been made clear to the court that Lucy Letby is definitively correct, not only with regard to neonates and the way that you treat neonates, but also with regard to the specific practice at Chester. She's absolutely correct, and Elizabeth Morgan is absolutely incorrect. And it's astonishing, incredible, extraordinary, ludicrous, embarrassing that the court heard this and that this ridiculous cross-examination took place. So at this point, we're going to look at the evidence of Dr. Jayaram, who's obviously critical to this trial. Indeed, even the prosecution stated that the prosecution effectively instructed the jury that you either believe Dr. Jayaram or you believe Lucy Letby, and that's how they set it up. So there's just there's 2 weeks of evidence, and much of it is completely irrelevant. And I want you to consider the ludicrousness of this being, this is 2 weeks, so that's longer than many trials that appear in a court. And it's certainly, it would be relatively short for a murder case, I would imagine, but it's longer than many trials that take place. And this is over a tube falling out and someone supposedly saw something. There's just no way this would ever be a standalone case in a court. It would just never happen, and yet it's now being treated as a standalone court case that has merit. Whereas if this on its own was put before the Crown Prosecution Service, one would hope they would say, hold on a second, you're saying a tube fell out and someone thinks they saw something at 3 o'clock in the morning, but then there's a different version of it where they said something completely different, but we're going to put this person away for life for murder and give them a whole life sentence. It's completely ridiculous. It's laughable. So Dr. Jayaram appears in the witness box here. And the first significant thing he says is here at 3:36 p.m, where he's talking about intubations. And he says here, it does not really matter what size the intubation tube is as long as it functions as it should. Now, I think this is an extremely dubious comment. I mean, it's obvious that an intubation tube needs to function as it should. That stands to reason. But to say that it doesn't matter what size the intubation tube is, I think, a highly dubious claim, because why would you have different sized tubes if it doesn't matter what size tube you use? Clearly there will be an ideal sized tube for the situation, the infant, the person that is being intubated, and so on. So to say that it doesn't really matter what size tube is used is, I would say, the most generous spin that you could possibly put on that is that it's a disingenuous statement. Of course, there's other less generous spins that you could also put on it. So Dr Jayaram's evidence spans 2 days. He begins in the mid-afternoon on one day and then continues on the next day. So all he really says, just picking out a couple of points from the first day, there's this comment about surfactant, which is essentially completely irrelevant. It's nothing to do with the allegations even. And then he's also talking about the APGAR scores, which again are completely irrelevant. The fact is that, we've discussed the APGAR scores previously. Again, they really have no relevance to a lot of these cases. They have no relevance to the clinical signs. However, here the clinical signs of the infant are irrelevant because the allegations are simply that Lucy Letby removed a breathing tube. Originally, this was going to be a murder case. They were going to suggest that Lucy Letby murdered the infant, even though the infant died three days after this supposed incident in a completely different hospital 20 miles away. But literally at the 11th hour, it was switched so that it would be attempted murder instead of actual murder. It would have been even more preposterous if this had gone in court as actual murder. But the APGAR scores are irrelevant, that this infant was chronically unwell. No one disputes that, even Dr Evans. This infant passed away 3 days later in a tertiary unit where the infant will have received much better care than it would have done at the Countess of Chester Hospital. So that's all Dr Jayaram said, irrelevant stuff, on the first day, and we're going to look at what he said on the second day in more detail. So I picked out a lot of the cross-examination of Dr Jayaram. I'm not going to read out every single word here because a lot of it is irrelevant, absolutely irrelevant to the allegations. But here there's some discussion of intubation and various lines that are intubated. And then he is talking about, Dr Jayaram talking about being at the nursing station, that he'd have his back to nursery room 1. Now, we have all seen how close the nursery room is to the corridor and to what he describes as the nursing station. The idea that people are going to go around pulling tubes out and doing all these things, I suppose pulling a tube out is theoretically more feasible than the injection of air cases. It's still phenomenally unlikely, seeing as you could so easily be caught, because you've got your back to the nursing stations, of course. Then there's some comments here about ventilation, saturations. None of this is particularly relevant. And then they're discussing the morphine signing chart. Nick Johnson refers to desaturation in the case of child K. And there's some discussion on whether or not child K is going to be transferred. This is undertaken with Joanne Williams, and Dr Jayaram's talking about there have been a number of unusual incidents. Now that is relevant because this seems to be the only justification for what he says in court with regard to Lucy Letby having supposedly deliberately extubated this infant. There appears to be no other basis for this whatsoever. Dr Jayaram says, "I will be very honest, I was very uncomfortable. I just had a feeling, knowing what happened before, and my internal dialogue was, stop being stupid, get on with your work, and I just wanted to go in and reassure everything was okay." So, I mean, this sounds frankly like complete and utter claptrap, and something that's being said in a sort of revisionist way. I don't give any credence to those statements whatsoever, particularly given what Dr Jayaram says later on and what we know about how honest or dishonest he may have been. Then there's some discussion on desaturations, what would happen if there's an extubation, etc. Then he says some stuff about the checking process. Dr. Jayaram here says the checking process is almost like a reflex, like doing an emergency stop in your car, and takes about 20 seconds. And he concedes here, there wasn't any obvious evidence that Lucy Letby had interfered with the tube. That's his concession. There's no obvious evidence that Lucy Letby had interfered with the tube. And yet here she is in court for a second time she was going to originally face murder allegations over this, despite the fact that there is no evidence. That's according to the primary witness in the case. And then there's some discussion on how child K saturated, desaturated, recovered, and so on. Essentially, again, this is completely irrelevant. So then Jayaram makes this comment that Letby was saying words along the lines of she's desaturating. There's some discussion about the suddenness of the desaturation, and then Jayaram says it's a possibility, but he has never seen a baby of child K's gestation dislodge their own tube. So we're back again to we've never seen this before. I mean, I find that assertion to be ludicrous. Everyone that I've spoken to said it's perfectly possible for an infant of child K's gestation to dislodge their own tube. And in addition, there are dozens and dozens of academic studies. I've shown these previously, I won't go over them again in this video, but there are so many studies about the accidental extubation of tubes by neonates. So he concedes here that it's possible. So therefore, if it's possible, I don't see how you can say definitively that it definitely didn't happen. It's incredible this is in court. I mean, it is frankly a complete and utter joke. He says it would take a lot of movement, but they happen all the time. Tube extubations happen all the time. We know this for a fact. I mean, his views in this case are preposterous, frankly. Then they go on about a load of stuff that's completely irrelevant. There's some discussion about who was involved in the reintubation. They're talking about re-establishing lines and a morphine infusion. Dr. Jayaram said he would have then gone to see child K's parents, so I assume that he can't actually remember this. There's some comments about the transport team. And there's a call received from Dr. Jayaram, baby dislodged the tube and had to be reintubated. So he didn't even note at the time that Lucy Letby had done anything. He said the baby dislodged the tube. So obviously he can't then say, well, it's impossible for the baby to dislodge the tube because the record from the transport team that Dr. Jayaram has probably recounted at the time that the baby has dislodged its own tube, as one would expect to be the explanation for such an extubation or such a dislodgement. So it's not looking good for Dr. Jayaram already, you'd have to say. And Dr. Jayaram said, I probably framed it as the tube was dislodged. Obviously, he definitely did say that. It's not a case of framing it. He will have said, there was a tube dislodged on the unit. It was the baby that dislodged it. And so he raised nothing at the time. And this is hardly surprising because it took hundreds and hundreds of days for him to even suggest that Lucy Letby was involved in this, as we will discuss now. So here we have Dr. Ravi Jayaram speaking about child K, talking about the breathing tube being dislodged and that Lucy Letby was present at the time. That is doubtful anyway. It's doubtful that Lucy Letby was even in the room. But let's assume for the sake of argument that she was in the room. This is the first time that Dr. Jayaram mentions this. This is at the infamous 15th of May meeting with Cheshire Police. Dr. Jayaram has had over 400 days to raise this. He's been through multiple internal processes. Obviously, he's in the hospital there working all the time. He has the opportunity to interact with executives at the hospital, and he does this on many occasions. They've had the Care Quality Commission in there. They've had the Royal College in there. There's been a grievance procedure in there. We know for a fact during the grievance procedure, he stated explicitly there is no evidence, we have nothing whatsoever concrete to suggest Lucy Letby has done anything wrong. Now that would have been the time, if he had significant evidence to indicate that Lucy Letby had deliberately extubated a baby, during the grievance would have been the time for him to raise this. He didn't raise it. And we know what the outcome of the grievance procedure was. And now suddenly he's there in the police station, and this is the first time that he remembers, oh yeah, I saw Lucy Letby attempting to murder a baby. I forgot about that. Then there is some further discussion of the second desaturation, and I suppose the significant thing you'd mention here, most of this is not really relevant. Just Dr Jayaram saying the desaturation was clinically explainable with the hazy left lung noted. Now what I'd say just at this point before we continue is that bear in mind these are desaturations related to an infant that was massively premature, that had chronic issues. I've not been over the issues with childcare yet. I may do that before the end of the video. But there's no reason to believe that this infant would be stable. This infant was never even close to being stable. And finally, of course, a critical point to reiterate yet again is that this infant died 3 days later after all this occurred. So the fact the infant is desaturating on a few occasions is hardly surprising. Then there's some more discussion of oxygen saturation levels dropping. Dr Jayaram explains the notes recorded on current situation for childcare on ventilator settings and so on, just general medical discussion. Again, this is basically completely irrelevant to the allegations. And then Dr Jayaram's giving some information about himself. He said he worked together with Dr Stephen Bray on the neonatal unit. Oh, we're aware of that, Ravi, don't worry. And agrees that role involved discussions on funding and risk management. He says ultimately departmental level, the buck stops with me. Dr Jayaram confirms Dr Smith was under his guidance when intubating childcare. So there's just some discussion about the intubation. They're trying here to hand wave the idea that the infant being fitted with the wrong size tube is relevant. I mean, it very obviously is relevant. Obviously, if you fit an infant with the wrong size tube, it's not a good thing. I mean, I don't mean to laugh, but I mean, it's beyond a joke. This particular portion of the trial, there's so many parts of it that are beyond a joke. But we're actually in court now trying to argue that, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we gave him the wrong size and nasal gastric tube. Why are the different sizes then? Why not just have one? Surely from a manufacturing perspective, it would be easier. You could just give everyone the same size and it wouldn't matter. I mean, it's just absolutely laughable. I mean, I would be interested to know what medically qualified people think, but I mean, I just view it as an absolute joke. So then we move on to the cross-examination of Jayaram by Ben Myers. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this because there's quite a lot of it and there's some critical stuff that I do want to go through. But this begins with these comments from Jayaram about intubation, sort of claiming there's no problem with intubation. But I think the fact that were repeated in multiple attempts is the problem. To say they were carried out without difficulty is not really accurate with regard to what occurred on the unit. But then he makes some comments about surfactant. Ben Myers suggests this should be within 5 minutes of birth, and Jayaram says within 30 minutes is fine. So the information that I have seen suggests that Ben Myers is correct, which I will show you now. So I put this scenario out, and if medical people wish to comment as well, that'd be great as always. But I provided the scenario to ChatGPT, and I could show the legislation and the documents that the AI is advocating. But as you can see here, in that scenario, surfactant would usually be given immediately after successful intubation and confirmation of ETT placement, effectively within minutes, not 30 minutes. The reason is that the baby was 25 weeks, had no spontaneous respiration, and so on. So I may have said earlier for this infant as well, nasogastric tube instead of endotracheal tube. So I apologise if I said that. So anyway, I think this claim made by Jayaram here is simply incorrect. So then they go back to discussing the intubation and ventilation. All of this is essentially irrelevant, but what the prosecution were trying to suggest is that this infant collapsed for no reason. One of the reasons it takes a while to deal with any of these court case transcripts is that it just goes on for hour after hour after hour addressing irrelevant stuff that is nothing to do with the allegations. And it's a very clear strategy of the prosecution to just string it out for as long as possible and use this no smoke without fire strategy that I've discussed previously. That didn't really happen in the original trial for Child K, where it just lasted for 3 days. But here, for 14 days, they discussed Child K. They went through all of this labyrinthine information that has nothing to do with the allegations. And then, as we'll see at the end of it, the prosecution just say, oh, well, you just have to decide, do you believe Dr Jayaram or do you believe Lucy Letby? After I've said murderer, 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 murderer over and over again. And all this stuff is basically irrelevant. But I'm just going to skip through it as quickly as I can. There's then discussing about the leaking of air leaking around the tubes, the size tube that was used. Again, Jayaram's defending the size tube used when we know it was the wrong size. Then there's discussion of the deterioration, timing of morphine infusion, and so forth. This is really the relevant comment at the end. The chances of a baby dislodging the tube spontaneously, especially small fragile 25 weekers, was minimal. He said that would have been further minimised if Child K was sedated. But the point is he's accepted it's possible. Now, I would ask you rhetorically, what is more likely? Is it more likely that this infant has self-extubated, or is it more likely that Lucy Letby has deliberately pulled the tube out, even though we have no evidence for the latter of those two things? Obviously, it's more likely that this was one of the thousands, if not millions, of accidental extubations that happen every year. Maybe millions is an exaggeration, but it wouldn't be surprising if there was tens of thousands. Certainly there will be thousands. So then there's some further discussion about resuscitation and intubation. And then Mr. Myers says quite rightly a blockage of the tube or a tube not fitted properly can cause issues. And we know for a fact they used the wrong size tube in this infant. That's why the prosecution is trying to defend them against this accusation, because we know for a fact that is the case. It's just the prosecution's downplaying it, and for some reason Dr Jayaram's trying to claim that it doesn't matter what type of tube you use, which is complete rubbish as far as I can see. And then finally we move on to something of relevance, where it's basically the same claim again, that it would take a big effort and quite a lot of strength for a baby to dislodge the endotracheal tube, and had never known a baby of Child K's gestation to have done so. But as we know, they shouldn't have been dealing with infants of this gestation in the first place, so he may have encountered very few. And it's another one of those examples that we see throughout the court case of, oh, I've never seen this before, so it can't happen. I mean, it very obviously can happen, so I'll just briefly show you some evidence in relation to that. So I'll just go over this as quickly as possible. You can see some of these studies here about accidental extubation of endotracheal tube in neonates. Originally in my book I had a list of 35 approximately, but I decided to take that out because it was too space consuming. But this list here just comes from a 1-second search, but there are many others available as well. Just overwhelming academic evidence about the incidence of accidental extubation of endotracheal tubes, and it's not a rare instance the more you look at it. But I'm not going to go over all that evidence in this video, I just wanted to show that very briefly. So then there's some discussion between Myers and Jayaram about the transport team. And Ben Myers asks, why didn't you check all the nurseries Letby was in if you were worried? Dr Jayaram says it is a good question. He said by this stage of the review they could not think of natural causes. That doesn't seem to be an answer to the question. It's an uncomfortable thought. You don't want to think it. You want to bury your head in the sand. And the only reason I wanted to walk into the room was to prove I was being ridiculous. So that seems like a completely disingenuous account of the events for several reasons. The first reason is this idea that it was an uncomfortable thought and he didn't want to think it. They immediately jumped to thinking that it could be a commonality with a nurse. That was immediate. It had already been going on for months by this stage, so he probably didn't know that there was going to be an official inquiry into all that and all the emails were going to be dug up, and that we'd know that what he's saying here is simply untrue. I mean, you can quite reasonably say that he's lying here, because he must know. I mean, this is an 8-month period. We're not talking about one instance. We're talking about something that went on for months and months and months. That is, I've documented this quite exhaustively on this channel. It's documented very extensively in the Thirlwell inquiry, and there must have been things that went on behind the scenes that we don't know about as well. So for him to say, oh, you know, I was so reluctant to think that it could be Lucy Letby who was doing something wrong, just bullshit, really. And also this account of the events, I decided I might, you know, I'd better walk in and just confirm that I was wrong. Well, we know for a fact, it says in the notes, that this was an accidental extubation. So if you'd have gone in there, according to your account, solely to prove to yourself that you're being ridiculous, then if you saw something that indicated that you weren't being ridiculous, then you would have remembered it in less than over 400 days. I think it's 438 days. I could be wrong. It's between 400 and 450 days between this incident and the time that you mention it for the first time. It would not take over 400 days for you to bring this to mind under those circumstances. I mean, this is total crap, obviously. So I can tell you exactly what happened, Ravi, just so that you know. Nothing happened at the time. You didn't have any suspicion whatsoever. You didn't have any reason to suspect anything. That's why there's no record of you having any suspicion, apart from this email, which completely contradicts the version that you gave in court. We'll go into that later. So you had no reason to suspect anything. That's why you didn't contact the police. That's why you never mentioned it in any of the times that you interviewed. That's why you never told executives at the hospital about it. And that's why you mentioned it only for the first time on the 15th of May 2017, over 400 days later. And the reason you mentioned it at that time is because you wanted to pique the interest of the police, to use your words. So that is what happened at that time, contrary to your recollection that you've recounted here. So then Mr. Myers says at this stage, you've got her. Dr. Jayaram says at the moment he walked in, child K was desaturating, and that could be due to a dislodged tube or a tube blockage. Up to that point she had been stable and the alarms had not sounded and no one had called for help. So again, that recollection is incorrect. He's moved his view around regarding the alarms. Other people indicate that the alarms definitely had sounded and that Jayaram is simply wrong. Let's be generous and say that that's him forgetting or incorrectly recounting what had occurred, rather than something that's deliberately misleading. He said at the time the important thing was to deal with the baby. You were presented with the fact that the tube had been dislodged deliberately. Dr. Jayaram, that was one of the possibilities. I was extremely uncomfortable. I didn't see the tube being dislodged. So, really, there's absolutely no evidence for this. This thing that he suddenly came up with, after over a calendar year, over 400 days later, he suddenly starts saying, oh, I suddenly decided Lucy Letby has dislodged this tube, even though I didn't see anything, even though I've conceded that it could have been an accidental extubation, even though there's nothing in the notes at the time, even though I didn't say anything to anyone, even though I didn't phone the police, even though I've changed my story. It's not looking very credible, is it, Rav, on the whole? So then we move on to this. I didn't realise this until I went to the retrial, that the court was shown this infamous ITV interview in which Dr. Jayaram says that they'll be etched on the mind on his mind for the rest of his life. So then at this point, Dr. Jayaram then proceeds to enter into another torrent of complete bollocks. You caught her red-handed, didn't you? Mr. Myers says to Dr. Jayaram. Dr. Jayaram says the culture of the NHS with clinicians by this time, there was a strategy to keep us quiet. People didn't really want to listen to us, to acknowledge our problems. So you didn't tell anyone, Rav. You didn't tell anyone. He says if he had rung police, they would have spoken to bosses and they would have replied to ignore them, the clinicians. So, I mean, this is extraordinary considering we know exactly what happened behind the scenes. We know you pestered and pestered and pestered the executives while providing absolutely no evidence, and then you almost went behind the back of the executives to the police, and then you basically told tales on Lucy Letby. That's exactly what happened. And you're trying to present this here as if you're some sort of victim in this situation. I mean, how disgusting. And then he goes on to say, we spent a long time trying to raise concerns and running into walls. Well, there's a few reasons for that, Rav. The first one is you didn't actually provide any evidence until you actually turned up to the police yourselves. That's the first thing. The second thing is you never mentioned this to anyone. It's not mentioned in the notes at the time, for example. And then a third thing is, as you well know, Lucy Letby had all of the points of her grievance upheld by Dr. Chris Green, by the independent panel of those who assessed her grievance. And as you also know, you were facing disciplinary proceedings at the time. As you also know, you could have raised this supposed attempted murder of a baby during the grievance procedure, but when asked about it, you explicitly indicated that there was no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. So that's just three examples of things that completely contradict this statement, Rav. I mean, as I say, this is just a torrent of bullshit. To be perfectly honest, I'm surprised by the time you'd finished speaking that your nose was the same length as when it began. So then it goes on. Had I had more courage, maybe I would have picked up the phone and called police. Well, you wouldn't, would you? Because you sat there in the grievance procedure and said there were no problems. So you wouldn't have phoned the police at that time. I agree with you don't have any courage. That's not in doubt. But you wouldn't have picked the phone up because you didn't actually witness anything. Because if you had witnessed something, you would have brought this up in the preceding 400 days, wouldn't you? Then Mr. Mai says, what stopped you from doing that? Dr. Jayaram said, adherence to procedure in terms of raising concerns with bosses. We didn't say anything to them. You never mentioned this to the executives. You never mentioned it when you were interviewed in the grievance procedure. You never mentioned it to Royal College. You never mentioned it to the Care Quality Commission. You never mentioned it in any internal processes. The first time you mentioned it was on the 15th of May. You never once mentioned it before then. Even in these emails, there's all these email chains with executives. Even when you say we should bring things up to pique the interest of the police, even then you don't mention it in your email. You only mention it for the first time in Blackham Police Station. So the idea you would have picked up the phone and called police, because is laughable, really. I agree that you're lacking in courage, but to say that this was due to adherence to procedure in terms of raising concerns, both yourself and Dr. Breary and other consultants after you and Dr. Breary had pestered them repeatedly raised concerns. We know that for a fact. You never mentioned this once. Why didn't you mention it? That's really for you to answer, but I would suggest the reason is because you didn't witness anything. So then he goes on to say, he had some faith in the system at the time, but a meeting was not held for 3 months. I guess we put faith in our medical leaders at executive level. So this is a completely shameless and gutless display of buck passing here. He claims here that a meeting was not held for 3 months. So you didn't say anything at that meeting about this incident. So it's completely irrelevant. The meeting could have been actually 12 months because it took over 12 months for you to say anything. And when you did, you still didn't say it internally. You still didn't tell executives. You still didn't make it known at the level of the hospital or within the NHS. You told the police directly. I guess you'd found enough courage at that time to speak out, presumably. He says the police would have got in touch with hospital executives and they would have said it was already in hand. It had already been raised internally. Yeah, you'd think that would be the kind of thing that the police would tend to do, but fortunately for you, the police just uncritically believed everything that you told them. So then Ben Myers says to Jayaram that he didn't contact police because things didn't happen as they said he had. And Dr. Jayaram said, I disagree. There was an element of denial. I didn't want to believe what I had seen. Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. What complete bullshit. You didn't see a thing. You've said that you didn't see anything. I mean, this is just stupendously ridiculous. How can you even sit there and say these things? It's mind-boggling. There was a fear of retribution. We were told it would have been inappropriate to contact police by hospital bosses. We were advised from the start contacting the police would be the wrong thing to do. You didn't tell them. You didn't tell them about this, as we've been over several times, Rav. You didn't tell anyone for over 400 days. If you'd said, oh, by the way, I saw Lucy Letby attempting to murder a baby, I tend to think the hospital bosses probably would have spoken to you differently. Don't you? What you're seeing here is someone who is used to any old crap that they come out with just being automatically accepted because they're a doctor and then they're a consultant. Exactly the same as you see with Dr. Evans. Like, you've seen that discussion he had with me recently where he just brought up that point about the court. I mean, how embarrassing. How embarrassing at this stage to say, oh, there's been some appeal judges and there was a court process and there was barristers and there was a jury. Like, is that the best you can do? Is that the best you could come out with? Is that the best thing you could concoct at this stage? And it's the same here with Dr. Jayaram. He just thinks he can say anything. Oh, yeah, we were told it was inappropriate. We were told this, we were told that. Complete crap. Absolute crap. Everything you've said here is just utter bullshit. He says, in retrospect, it would have been the right thing to do. Do you think so, Rav? Do you think if you see someone attempting to murder a baby and you're a doctor and they're a nurse, that you should tell someone about it? What an incredibly insightful example of hindsight. You had multiple opportunities. I mean, I'm not going to go over them all again. But if you'd really seen something, and if you really wished to report it internally, you would have done so. You wouldn't have needed to go on some training course to be taught how to do it. This is just such crap. Dr. Jayaram says he found it beyond coincidence that with the alarms not going off, which is not true, other people that were there say that the alarms were going off. And seeing Letby standing there, that's doubtful. It's doubtful she was even in the room, let alone if she was in the room, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was doing what she's supposed to do, which is observe the infant, which is standard policy. It's standard policy at the Council of Chester, and it's standard for a neonatal nurse as well. That's what they're supposed to do. There is nothing suspicious here. That's why you didn't say anything. That was actually the correct thing to do. You didn't say anything because you hadn't witnessed anything. And this should never be in a courtroom in a million years. It's actually a complete and utter national embarrassment that someone is facing a whole life order in relation to this absolute crap. I was going to say again that it boggles the mind. I'd like to think of something that it does that's stronger than boggling the mind. It destroys your faith in the human race, perhaps. I don't know how to describe it. Mr. Myers says the issue of child K was not raised with the police until June 2017. We know now that it's May. He may not have had access to these documents, possibly. Dr. Jayaram says that is when the police investigation started. Dr. Jayaram said there was no precedent for Letby, and knowing now, he would challenge the hierarchy. Yeah, he challenged the hierarchy by actually doing something. He says at the time the tube being dislodged was one of the possibilities. It's still one of the possibilities now, Rav. It's just the least likely possibility. Dr. Jayaram said he had discussions with Dr. Breary a few weeks later about the neonatal unit, but he didn't mention anything. We know for a fact he didn't. It's not in any of the internal documents. There are hundreds and hundreds of documents with you discussing things, with you pestering the executives. You never said shit about this case. We know that for a fact. Anyway, I'm just going to read now. Otherwise, I'll just be literally responding to every single thing that he says. So I'll wait until he says something new. But I'm going to have to respond again at the end of this slide. Dr. Jayaram says at the time he cannot go throwing around accusations about Letby. We don't believe that people who work in healthcare go to cause harm, and I think I was a victim of my cognitive dissonance. I'm not going to respond to that, I could. Mr. Myers said he didn't engage in such a conversation with Letby, and she continued to work the remainder of her shift without informing anyone else. Then Dr. Jayaram says, what am I going to say? Hey everybody, this is what's going on. So, as you'd already jumped to that conclusion from day one, 8 months in advance of this, if you'd actually witnessed something, this would have been what you needed at the time. You could have said, oh look, I've actually witnessed Lucy Letby dislodging a tube. I actually have tangible evidence that would point to this. You didn't even manage to put that in the court case, of course, because there isn't any tangible evidence. But certainly you would mention it in that context, but in fact, you would just mention it in any context. Because in any context where you thought someone had deliberately extubated an endotracheal tube, that would be attempted murder. So you would have told someone immediately. Dr. Jayaram's clinical notes are shown to the court, which Mr. Myers says does not record the tube being dislodged. Of course it doesn't, because he didn't think it was. We know that because he didn't tell anyone. Dr. Jayaram says the thing at the forefront of his mind was the stabilisation of child K. No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be if you'd actually seen something. If you'd seen something, yes, you would have to stabilise child K, but of course, apart from anything else, you would have confronted Lucy Letby. Never mind phoning the police or going to the executives or anything like that. You would have confronted her and saying, "What the hell are you doing?" You didn't do that because you had no suspicion. You had no reason to have any suspicion. That's why it's not in the notes. That's why he didn't say anything. He added he had mentioned it to the transport team. He accepts it is not in his written notes. Of course it's not in the notes. Let's continue. Mr. Myers asks about the alarm system. Dr. Jayaram says he is absolutely certain it was not sounding. Wrong. Completely wrong, we know that for a fact, but now you're going to be made to look really stupid as well. He's asked to look at a 2008 police interview at Blackham Police Station, and at the time he said he couldn't remember. Dr. Jayaram, I don't know why I said that. The reason you said that, Rav, is because you were being honest at that time, and this whole thing is a complete fabrication. It's a combination of very obviously fabricated statements and probably false memories. Let's be generous and assume this is a false memory and this is not something that you fabricated. Let's assume the alarm not sounding is just your mind playing tricks on you. That's an incredibly generous interpretation, by the way. Mr. Myers says Dr. Jayaram said for a second and third time later that interview he couldn't remember if the alarm had gone off or not. Dr. Jayaram says with absolute certainty it was not an alarm sounding that prompted him to go in the room. So I think it's truly disgraceful and disgusting that he says these things under oath. There's no way he can say that with absolute certainty. We've seen the calibre of his memory already, and obviously during the police interview it's worth noting this was a relatively short period of time. Even though he should have mentioned this much sooner than he did, it's a much shorter period of time because it's 2018. And this supposedly took place in 2016. Now it's 6 years. No, that's not even true because this isn't the original trial. Now it's 8 years ago, but now he can say with absolute certainty that there wasn't an alarm sounding. But 6 years previous, he contradicted that 3 times. And other people who gave evidence in the court, nurses who were on the unit, also contradicted him. But now he can say with absolute certainty that there were no alarms sounding and that's not why he went into the room. The ITV interview had Dr. Jayaram saying on the night of February 16th to 17th, that night is etched in my memory, it will be my nightmares forever. Dr. Jayaram says he wished he had the courage to escalate it in a different way, and that is why the night will be in his nightmares. What crap. The transport team note of 0555 call received from Dr. Jayaram, baby dislodged the tube and had to be reintubated. So that's nothing that we don't know already, but we get Jayaram saying these things. It's very difficult to discuss the discomfort on thinking the unthinkable, even though we jump to that conclusion immediately. So finally, I just want to show you a couple more examples of his cowardice, speaking with Nicholas Johnson here. Firstly, he claims that he didn't ring the police due to a lack of confidence in the hospital system, and he just failed to mention it to anyone as well. And then at the end, Johnson says to him, "Did you receive support from management? We were told explicitly it would be the wrong thing to contact police as it would damage the reputation of the trust. But you could have told the executives, couldn't you? You could have told the executives that you'd witnessed Lucy Letby attempting to murder a baby. The problem is they would have actually examined this, as we have seen happen now, and they would have found out that it was complete bullshit. That's if you'd even thought these thoughts up until... We don't even know if this had even crossed your mind, and your memory certainly can't recount it in any accurate way. It's quite possible that you never even considered this until you decided to pique the interest of police. Certainly, we know for a fact you never mentioned it to anyone until that point." So in the closing comments, despite these 14 days of bullshit that occur in the court case, at the end of the retrial, what does Nicholas Johnson say? Do you believe Dr. Jayaram saying what he saw? Do you believe he's telling you the truth about what he saw? And if you do you accept what we allege Lucy Letby was trying to do, bearing in mind what we've also proved? And he says the whole case comes down to this single issue. So they could have just basically, this trial could have lasted a minute. Nick Johnson could have just said, right, Dr. Jayaram, what did you see? This. Lucy Letby, you're a murderer, you're a murderer, you're a murderer. Right, we rest our case. Now you've got to decide whether you believe Dr. Jayaram or Lucy Letby. Because there's no other evidence for anything else. Everything else is just a complete waste of time, apart from Mr. Johnson who got paid. in terms of any kind of objective evidence or any kind of evidence that has any merit or value whatsoever, there wasn't any. And then Mr. Myers not unreasonably says that if Lucy Letby was not convicted of the cases, would we be here now? And the answer, of course, is no. This would never have gone anywhere near a courtroom. It would have been laughed out of court. In fact, the police would be admonished for even sending this to the Crown Prosecution Service in the first place. So let's remind ourselves of this infamous email that has been seen by Unheard, that is mentioned in this article, in which Jayaram stated that Lucy had called him for help and this was why he went to see baby K. So that would be the only reason this is possibly in court. If Lucy had called him for help, this case is over. It shouldn't be in court anyway, obviously. But there's literally nothing then. This was exculpatory evidence that could have helped Letby's defence team, yet her lawyers were not told of its existence before either trial. It was not disclosed to them until late September last year. In his first account of baby K's desaturation, Jayaram wrote that far from going to check baby K because he felt uncomfortable that she was alone with Letby, the real reason was that Letby herself had raised the alarm and asked him for help. He set this out in an email to 7 of his colleagues dated the 4th of May 2017. That is the exact time when he says we need to pique the interest of the police. Its timing was significant. The previous July, Letby had been moved to clerical work as a result of concerns raised by Jayaram and other doctors, but she had lodged a grievance for bullying and harassment, and this had been upheld. At this time, the authors of this article, Lucy and David Rose, didn't know, because the Thirlwell Inquiry have only just released this document, that Jayaram was facing potential disciplinary procedures because of that grievance. Now the doctors were hoping to involve the police, who at first had seemed reluctant. Jayaram was commenting on a draft of a report they would shortly send to detectives, asking them to investigate. He was blunt about his purpose for the police to have their interest piqued. To do this, he suggested, the doctors should highlight explicitly for these cases that Lucy Letby was in attendance and close proximity to the incubators in those situations we know for a fact she was. He went on to suggest additions to the report about cases with which he had been involved, hopefully more in a stating the facts way than a subjective finger-pointing way. Although this looked very much like a subjective finger-pointing way, Rav, wouldn't you agree? Jayaram's email described baby K's deterioration and suggested Letby called him about low oxygen levels, a detail that appears to conflict with his later testimony. After the other nurse left the room, she wrote, staff nurse Letby was at incubator and called Dr Jayaram to inform of low saturations. He also wrote that the baby's subsequent death was consistent with complications from extreme prematurity. The section in the email about baby K was not included in the final report to the police. So in response to that, Sir David Davis, as we know, has made this request for Cheshire Police to investigate Dr Ravi Jayaram. In this letter he says, the implications of this email are serious. The leaked emails would have been of substantial relevance to the courts. The jury in her trial may have reached its verdict on the basis of misleading or incomplete testimony. Given that Jayaram's statements formed a critical part of the prosecution's case, I believe there is compelling public interest in determining whether perjury may have been committed. I am therefore making a formal complaint against Dr Jayaram. Cheshire Constabulary now has a clear obligation to launch a formal perjury investigation into Dr Jayaram's testimony. The Cheshire Police have responded saying, the Chief Constable has received the letter, this has been reviewed, and he will be responding in due course, addressing all the concerns raised. This was nearly a year ago. Over an email. It's an email you need to check. Why is it taking so long? I asked myself. So what I'll say finally is that I was going to go over Lucy being interviewed in relation to Child K, but that would take far too long, I think, for this video. So I'll probably do that in a future video. I've obviously been over this bit where Lucy says something that is completely correct, that we know to be correct, and is contradicted by Elizabeth Morgan, who's completely incorrect, and then Nick Johnson accuses her of lying when she's absolutely telling the truth, and this could have been confirmed, and the court could have been told this. So, in summary, I'm going to go through some of the issues with the retrial of Child K, quite aside from the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever in this entire process. Firstly, the court heard from a nursing consultant, Elizabeth Morgan, who is not a neonatal nurse. Elizabeth Morgan gave the court incorrect nursing information. Elizabeth Morgan also gave the court information that flagrantly contradicted official policy at the Countess of Chester. Lucy Letby had, in fact, acted correctly at the time based on what we know about this incident. There are some question marks regarding whether Lucy was actually present. Lucy then correctly told the court what a nurse should do in those circumstances. She also told the court quite rightly what the policy was at the Countess of Chester at that time. As a response to doing this, Lucy was accused of lying by Nick Johnson when she was in fact categorically correct and accurate in her assertions. The court was repeatedly told incorrect information about tube intubation. The court was also told incorrect information about the application of surfactant. The testimony of Dr Jayaram was crammed full of palpable nonsense, even if we didn't know that he had said something else previously. The comments of Dr Jayaram regarding his failure to escalate his supposed suspicions are entirely laughable. At the end of this debacle, Nick Johnson informed the court that the jury should make a decision entirely on the basis of whether or not they trust Jayaram more than Lucy Letby. Since the trial was conducted, we now know that Jayaram gave a version of events that is, to be phenomenally generous, highly problematic. This has prompted Sir David Davis to call on Jayaram to be investigated for perjury. So that just scratches the surface of the farcical retrial of Child K. In my book on the Lucy Letby case, I've gone into much more detail and basically I've buried Jayaram completely. Someone's going to have to get a shovel and dig him out, which is what this image is supposed to show. It does rather look as if they're trying to bury him, but they're supposed to be digging him out of the hole. Finally, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone that subscribes to the channel. I've reached 7,000 now. That's pretty amazing. It's way beyond my expectations, but it's still growing regularly. Still goes up a little bit every day. And I realise it may accelerate from July when my book is released. We'll wait and see. It's obviously been difficult to balance this and finishing my book, or writing my book. And I'm in the final furlongs of doing that now. It will be sent off in the next few weeks to be printed. And I won't have to do any more work on it. Well, I do actually have some more jobs to do after that. But one day there's going to be a point where I don't have to do anything else and I can concentrate on doing YouTube. I suppose in the immediate aftermath of the release I'll be doing things as well. But there will come a point when I can concentrate on YouTube more. I've done my best to keep things going while I've been balancing these two demanding jobs. But I really appreciate the support while I'm doing that. It's enormously appreciated. So if you have any comments, queries, observations, anything else to share with me based on this video, please do so, and I'll look forward to reading them.